Thanks very much, Margaret. So one of the key, I suppose, developments in the 60s, apart from the election of Jerry Fitt, apart from the 11-plus generation challenging nationalism and the unionist state, John Hume's articles in 1962, urging the nationalists to adopt a more constructive approach to Stormont, saying that bad opposition means bad government, was the rise of the Campaign for Social Justice, a group of professional people in Northern Ireland, starting with the McCluskeys in Dungannon, and I'd call on Dr. Myrtle here to address that.
Thank you, Margaret. And now, as I say, for something completely different. What I find when you go to give a talk or when you're writing a book or a chapter or an article, it's always very difficult because things don't happen in that nice, smooth narrative. All of these different things are all happening at the same time. And it's quite difficult to convey that in a kind of straightforward way. So that, I think, is what you need. Thank you very much. You need to bear in mind. I'm looking at the McCluskeys, the Homeless Citizens League and the Campaign for Social Justice in the 60s. And again, 20 minutes to talk about this very dramatic period in history is very short. But I think it's fascinating in what the details bring to light about events preceding the rise of the civil rights movement. And a wee bit like today, when all these huge debates are happening in high politics, the rest of us are trying to live our lives impacted on, if you like, by the influence of all of that, but very often not taken great note of. So we all know that given the violent and controversial nature of the setting up of the state of Northern Ireland, Stormont regime always faced some degree of opposition. As Margaret said, there was no real incentive for them to make change in the first couple of decades of the state. Their determination to maintain and indeed to bolster the unionist strength, I think, was the main priority at that time. But local, national and international change would bring about slow and indeed painful change. The lack of engagement of nationalist representatives in terms of government participation was one problem. But we saw people of the 50s generation, particularly the second half of the 50s onwards, moving on with the benefits of the welfare state, the benefits of a new educational system, which, as Eamon mentioned, brought about the rise of an educated, rising middle-class Catholic strand in the demography. So I think all of that's very important as a background to change. Now, we probably are all aware that housing, or lack of Catholic housing, was at the centre in some areas of debate and of rising frustration. And of course that didn't begin in the 1960s. In the post-war period, in the immediate aftermath of war, the housing situation was seen to be absolutely terrible. It was reckoned that about 200,000 new houses were needed right across the province for everyone. Those needs were to be met by the new Housing Trust, which, to be fair, completed 48,500 dwellings between 1965 and 1972. However, while there was fairness in the distribution of houses in many areas, Belfast perhaps and Antrim and Down, there was great inequality in the distribution of these houses by some local councils who had the power to allocate housing. And this sowed the seeds of future acrimony. For example, of 1,048 council houses built in the mainly Catholic county of Fermanagh in this period, 82% were allocated to Protestants. Such discrimination was most evident, as Margaret has suggested, west of the Bann, the result of the combination of the first-past-the-post electoral system, the gerrymandering of council boundaries to boost unionist representation in marginal wards, and the propensity also of people to move into already segregated communities along religious lines. Now, of course, there's a great deal of debate about the statistics, but there are more than numbers here. Issues which impacted on personal and family life, as well as on community life. We saw newlywed couples. The tradition amongst the Catholic families west of the Bann was that you moved. There was no housing, so you moved in with your parents and you had children, and just the house became more and more crowded, and the housing situation was pretty drastic. Now, I'm going to go back a wee bit further than the 60s to show you an early example of the frustration here, if I can. Okay, sorry. I'm talking here.
Just press that wee button there.
I did that, but it didn't work. It's okay, I've got this one.
They are.
Okay, it's this one. That's okay. Okay, I've got it. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm looking here at an early example of Catholic frustration at the situation what can be seen in Derry. This is a springtime camp in Derry. It was originally an American naval base set up in 1941. It housed civilian technicians and naval officers, and the camp consisted of 302 huts and included a chapel, a gym, a laundry, a canteen, a barber shop, a theatre and a jail. So a whole big housing area. When the camp emptied in 1945 at the end of the war, it was due to be demolished. However, local families, desperate for their own living space, judged these disused huts to be a step up from their own crowded or indeed non-existent accommodation, and squatters began to move in. The council, rather than rehouse those Catholic families who had set up home in totally unsuitable, freezing cold Nissan huts, eventually decided to install water, electricity, and charge the tenants 5 shillings a week. At the peak of its existence, almost 400 families lived in these huts. And this website here, well, that's the BBC one. There is a Strandtown site, which is absolutely brilliant. Really crowded conditions, very cold, which meant that people were burning wood-burning fires and so forth, which were extremely dangerous. In 1959, when about 400 families lived in these huts, 5 children almost burnt to death following the spark from a fire. And the mothers of Springtown began an escalating campaign for better housing. They disrupted council meetings, staged marches, courted the media, organised petitions, and sent delegations to the authorities, such as Derry Corporation, for example, and appealed to the courts. Through the early 50s and 60s, some families moved out of the camp, homes very often crumbling, bailiffs very often sent in, the heaters and the fires, again causing many almost fatal, if not fatal, incidents. And many others emigrated from Springtown, seeing no hope for their families in the future. This continued until the last person in Springtown to be rehoused was in 1967. Now, though the women that brought the issue to public attention fought with determination on behalf of their families, they fought as mothers. Theirs was, if you like, a very maternalistic campaign. They were working class people arguing for better rights for their families. And also note that in these early demonstrations, their aim was to be treated as British citizens with respect and with equality. No real progress was made, however. In the spring and summer of 1963, Angela McChrystal and around 40 other young women began to raise the question of the lack of housing provision for Catholics in the Dungannon area. They drafted a petition to the council and began a series of protests, wheeling their prams to meetings of Dungannon Council to highlight the urgency of the situation. And it's very clear, particularly from Angela McChrystal, that she was influenced by the American Civil Rights campaign. She greatly admired Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, and in the marches you often saw placards reading things like, "Racial discrimination in Alabama, hits Dungannon. They were aware, however, of their vulnerability. Given this visibility, they had to be seen as respectable women because they were talked about in all kinds of ways as being tramps and outcasts and what have you. So that if you see any of the photographs, they're always well-dressed women pushing along the prams. In 1963, and continuing this campaign, the Homeless Citizens League was formed. Basically, when Con and Patricia McCluskey joined with this women's group, we had a real difference happening almost immediately. They were both middle class, a GP and a social worker who had formerly worked in the slums of Glasgow. Well educated. They really, with a committee of 67 members, began with the Homeless Citizens League to step up the campaign. Again, a deputation sent to the council, ignored. Of 142 recently completed houses in a unionist ward, the houses were all given to young Protestant newlyweds. Again, marches continued, mostly by women. And in a very obvious attempt to divide the protesters, the council at this stage offered Angela McChrystal a home, which caused her a great deal of consternation, but she was persuaded to take the house. When the council ignored the League's request for a meeting, the group organised a squat of prefabricated houses in Fairmount Park, which were then being vacated by Protestant families who were moving to new council housing. So again, taking over what's being left behind. 37 women and their families took part, supported in some cases by the vacating tenants, some of whom handed over their keys to the protesters. As Anne Dunlop, one of the women, remarked, it was a matter of self-reliance and desperation. What we had here was direct action. Initially, the council threatened to cut off the water and the electricity. In fact, I think they did so. And when it was pointed out to them that this was illegal, they had to reconnect the services. And this action got a great deal of press coverage. Again, I think the evidence of the influence of the McCluskeys is very important. Their main aim was to collect the facts. They were always being accused of making it up, of exaggerating, of so on and so forth. But they took things further than the previous protesters. Facts were first and foremost, and publicity. And again, moving beyond the locality. They sent a deputation to Stormont, and even the Belfast Telegraph began to take notice, where before the media had not really engaged with protesters. Now they began to take notice, which meant that the councils had to promise that things would progress. The outcome in this first case of squatting was that the council was forced to leave the squatters in possession of the houses, and they also began to build a new council estate. So things began to change, and I've just showed here the timeline of things happening. In January 1964, in order to further highlight instances of discrimination in housing and employment across the province, the McCluskeys formed the Campaign for Social Justice. Again, the collection of data was a priority, and to bring publicity outside Northern Ireland, and indeed outside Ireland itself. So the committee in this case was made up of 9 professional men, 3 women. We're seeing a different kind of organisation emerging. And Patricia McCluskey in 1964 was one of 4 members of the Campaign for Social Justice elected to Dungannon Council, when 7 members ran on a platform of vote for justice, vote for the team. They began a publicity campaign and made contact with sympathetic figures in Britain, again engaging with politicians in Westminster. And I have to say that not only were they opposed by more extreme unionism, but also more extreme nationalism. Were very unhappy with this kind of approach to Stormont. And just a couple of the pamphlets that were issued by these campaigns, which were, again, about housing discrimination, about the statistics around employment, who held office in the civil service, and so on and so forth. Getting it down in black and white after detailed research. However, things did begin to move ahead. Campaigning such as this provided the inspiration in February 1967 for the formation of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement, joining with other contemporary strands of activism, individuals involved in left-wing politics, including trade unionists, active Republicans, members of the Connolly Association and the Communist Party, as well as some concerned Liberals. All were involved. And Margaret sort of gave us the framework of the high political scene. But these things bubbling onto the surface, and we could take any one of those strands, whether Labour or whatever, to see how things begin to merge together. For me, it's that old adage, the personal is political. Things that are happening in family life and affecting people on the ground being brought to some kind of political activism. So from direct, local, working class action, seeking their rights, to a more middle class and professional political leadership, national and international changes in the context of discrimination were also very important, because the facts were coming out at a time when such things were making international news. The willingness to engage with Westminster and the British political parties, and the example of the American activists, all were important. And we would see the civil rights movement broadening out these concerns into one very specific campaign. Thank you very much.